Good afternoon and welcome to the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario's webinar on our 2017 Greenhouse Gas Progress Report. My name is Nancy Pilardi and I'm the Climate Change Manager here at the Office of the Environmental Commissioner. As many of you are no doubt aware, the Environmental Commissioner is Ontario's environmental watchdog. A key responsibility of our office is to monitor and report on progress made toward reducing greenhouse gas emissions in Ontario. I will make a few preliminary comments and then the Commissioner, Diane Sachs, will walk you through the report. This webinar is based on our Greenhouse Gas Progress Report called From Plan to Progress, which was released and tabled to the Ontario Legislature just over 2 weeks ago on January 30th. The full report, summary, and several technical appendices can be downloaded from our website at www.eco.on.ca. As shown on this slide, this year's report contains 10 chapters and covers a wide range of issues. Given today's time constraints, we're reviewing the major findings and recommendations from the first 6 chapters in this webinar. The Commissioner will first present an overview of Ontario's emissions levels and then review policy development over the past year. This includes a discussion of the cap and trade program, a review of potential carbon offsets, and how the revenues raised through the allowance auctions have been used to date. We will also focus on freight trucking, the fastest growing source of provincial greenhouse gas emissions. Our report also discusses whether the government is taking climate change seriously and steps it can take to reduce its own carbon footprint. We will not be presenting these 2 chapters in this webinar. However, they will be included in the slide deck that all participants will receive after the webinar. Much of the information in this year's report builds upon our 2016 report, Facing Climate Change. If you haven't yet watched our 2 webinars from last year, I would encourage you to do so. Our first webinar provided an introduction to climate science. In the second webinar, we presented an introduction to cap and trade, discussed Ontario's link with Quebec and California, and gave an overview of the Climate Change Action Plan that the Ontario government released in June 2016. We will not be reviewing these basics in today's webinar. So again, if you'd like to learn more about those, you can find links to those webinars on our website. Before we hear from Commissioner Sachs, a few technical details. We expect that the presentation will take about 45 minutes. We will be allowing additional time afterward to address questions. You are invited to submit questions at any time using the question and answer pane on the GoToWebinar window at the top right corner of your screen. You can expand or contract your control panel using the orange arrow. We will hold all the questions until after the Commissioner's presentation and try to respond to as many as possible in the time available. The webinar will also be recorded and will be available for viewing on our website in the next few days. So with that taken care of, I would now like to introduce Commissioner Diane Sachs to present the key findings and highlights from our report. Welcome, Commissioner.
Thank you, and thanks everybody for joining us this afternoon. I'm really proud to talk with you today about my second climate report to the Ontario Legislature. Last year, I talked with Ontarians all over the province about climate change, and maybe some of you. We talked about what each of us can do and about the future we owe to the young people that we love. And meanwhile, of course, the news keeps getting worse. Climate change is worsening hurricanes, floods, droughts, and forest fires, and greenhouse gas emissions are continuing to grow around the world. So we know that more human, economic, and environmental disruption lies ahead. It's too late to just talk about climate change. It's time to act. So fortunately, Ontario has a lot to be proud of. Ontario was one of the first jurisdictions in the world to phase out coal. In 2015, the first year after we stopped burning coal, Ontario's greenhouse gas emissions were lower than they had ever been since we started keeping records in 1990. And since the Climate Change Action Plan was released in the summer of 2016, the Ontario government has really done an impressive amount to improve its policies and actions on climate change. One of the key things was to join many other jurisdictions in putting a price on carbon, which is a crucial tool that we need to slow climate change. And the method that Ontario chose was cap and trade, and we were very pleased to be able to report that 2017, the first year, went well. You'll see some slides about this. We're also very pleased to see that Ontario's new carbon market link with California and Quebec has gone ahead as of January 1st this year, creates a combined market of about 61 million people, and that should help keep costs down for Ontario families and businesses and provide some flexibility for innovators and businesses. Concerns about predictability were reduced when the government announced what its caps will be on allowances for every year till 2030. It's very important for businesses to be able to plan ahead. And we also saw improvements in how some ministries finally incorporate climate change into their mandates. And I hope that you've noticed the new power of municipalities to adopt bylaws on climate change in the Planning Act, climate change being treated seriously in the long-term infrastructure plan. There was a lot of good news. There was, of course, also a lot to improve, and we hope that our recommendations will help the government do better this year. 3 areas we particularly pointed out need improvement. One is to work with California and Quebec to make the linked market work better and to make offsets have a real impact. The second is to get more bang for each buck of cap and trade revenue. And the third is to make sure that climate change is taken seriously in broader government decision-making. So with that overview, I'm going to move ahead and tell you a little bit about the actual chapters in the report as soon as we're technically ready. There we are. Okay, so chapter 1 is about our emissions. This is really good news. Now, when I was a young lawyer, it was absolutely clear that GDP, gross domestic product, or the size of the economy, was linked with emissions, and that we couldn't have emissions go down if we also wanted the economy to grow. And as you can see in this picture, since about 2005, Ontario has done exactly that. Our emissions have gone down, but our GDP and our population have gone up. This is a real achievement. It's something to be proud of. Now, we know why. As you can see from this drawing, almost all the reductions came from electricity. There's also significant contribution from industry, particularly one large chemical plant. But it was closing the coal plants that made this possible. And look at the impacts of our coal closures. As you can see, greenhouse gas emissions from the electricity sector have changed a great deal in the last 20 years. They were already fairly high in 1990, but dropped when the nuclear plants came online and then soared again when several of the nuclear units went out. And as you can see, has been improving ever since then. Other sectors, there's no other sectors that have as clear a story as that. The waste sector emissions, the big thing about this is that we don't really know what the waste sector emissions are. These are rather loose guesses about how much methane may or may not be coming from landfills and sewage plants and that kind of thing. We'll need to have better numbers to know what to do in this sector. We know in agriculture, numbers about flat. Animal agriculture is down, but crop production and fuel use are up, so on balance, there's not a lot of difference. In the building sector, as you can see, residential emissions have stayed about the same despite population growth. And that's because individual households use less energy now than they used to. But the total numbers of square feet that we have, floor space has greatly increased, and so total consumption is up. In fact, as I said last year, every fossil fuel in Ontario except coal is up. The industrial reductions, as you can see, are largely from the chemical and fertilizer sector, although we do see some real improvements being hard won in some of the other sectors as well. And this is our real Achilles heel. As you can see, transportation is our largest and fastest growing source of emissions. And as you can see, it's really freight that is driving the increases. Freight is the only sector of the Ontario economy where the emissions have doubled since 1990, and they're continuing to rise. Now, most of these emissions are from fossil fuels. There are some other sources, but primarily what we're talking about is the fossil fuels that we use. So what's happened since last year, as I mentioned in the introduction, really quite a lot. The biggest single factor is cap and trade. We've been talking about putting a price on carbon for these many years, and we did it. And there were all sorts of fears about how cap and trade was going to work, and actually the first year went fairly smoothly. And as you can see, every auction's a little bit different, but they all did fairly well, and they brought in about $1.9 billion. Now, that doesn't mean that all auctions will continue to go this smoothly. There are several reasons to think that the first couple of auctions in 2018, there may not be nearly as much market demand. For one thing, California and Quebec were at the end of a compliance period in 2017, so their emitters had to make sure that they got enough allowances to fulfill their compliance obligations. No one is facing a compliance deadline this year. And then, of course, we saw in 2016 in California, when there's political uncertainty, markets don't do as well. And this year in Ontario, we have some political uncertainty. Nevertheless, first year went very well. Very helpful that we now know how the cap will reduce from now to 2030, because businesses need to be able to plan ahead. And that also allows us to assess with some confidence whether cap and trade will meet the federal requirements under the Pan-Canadian framework. And as you can see, it does. The brown diamond shows you what the federal requirement is for emission reductions by 2030. And the cap and trade system is predicted to easily meet that requirement. Now, I talked last year a little bit about who needs allowances and who doesn't. And I'll just run that over quickly. Basically, about 82% of Ontario's greenhouse gas emissions are covered by the cap and trade system. So on the right, you see agriculture and waste, not their fuel use, but their other emissions, methane, nitrous oxide, and so on, are not covered by the cap. That's about 18%. The rest of the emissions from Ontario are covered by the cap, but in two different ways. There are the large final emitters, the big industries that people often think are the source of greenhouse gas emissions. They have individual compliance obligations. And altogether, they're about a quarter of Ontario's emissions. As you'll see, there's a line there for voluntary participants. There's about 80 smaller companies that opted in, that they will have to have their own allowances, but in exchange, they get a lot of those allowances for free. The rest of the Ontario economy are fossil fuel users, basically all of us, to drive around and heat our homes and our offices and everything else that we do. And all of that fossil fuel use needs allowances, and there's no free allowances for that. But you and I don't have to individually register. That would be tremendously cumbersome. And so our fuel distributors, the people who sell us natural gas and petroleum products, they have to buy allowances, and they will include the cost when they sell us the product. Now, what's going to be happening with all that money? The province Climate Change Action Plan contains a lot of plans and ideas for ideas they want to do with money. A lot of them good ideas, some of them not such good ideas. But they can't do it without the money. And what we saw this year is that the province did start rolling out a large number of the incentives that or at least programs that they described in the Climate Change Action Plan. And as the money has become available, they've announced it and allocated it to various programs. And here you can see a list of a number of the ones that were announced this year in the transportation field. There are also a number of announcements in the building field. And you may remember that last year the province was talking about having a green bank to help particularly consumers improve the efficiency of their homes. So this bank has now been created. At least it has a board of directors, although I don't think it has any staff yet. And it's called Green On, and you've probably seen some ads as they start handing out money. And in addition, we've had some other initiatives on buildings. Now, in addition to the cap and trade program, there also are some baby steps being taken to address emissions in the uncapped sectors. The Waste-Free Ontario Act is a very important new statute, and some of you know we did a special report on it last year. If you haven't seen it, we encourage you to go and watch the webinar on Beyond the Blue Box, which talks about the Waste-Free Ontario Act. Organic waste being a very important source of methane, and methane being a very potent greenhouse gas. This has a significant potential to help. and some baby steps getting on soil emissions, forest and wetland strategy. These are very important areas that Ontario is just starting to think about. Now, everything that Ontario does is in a larger context. It's not just that climate change is a worldwide issue, it's also that the policies interact with what's happening outside Ontario. And it might be helpful to remember that we're just not alone. About 15% of the world economy is already covered by a price on carbon, most of that a cap and trade system. China announced in December the world's largest cap and trade system, which will cover all electricity production in their country and will gradually spread out to their other industries. And so there's a lot of lessons being learned, and the World Bank has been particularly good at pulling together what makes a good cap and trade system, and we were pleased to see that Ontario's design stacked up well against what the World Bank had called for. The link with the Western Climate Initiative, that is with California and Quebec, we do expect that to reduce the short-term costs for Ontario residents and businesses. Now, we know what the carbon tax would be if we used the federal backstop, and you can see that on the left-hand side of the slide in red. We don't know for sure what the price of allowances will be in the market, but we got two good quality analyses that are predicting what the price will be in the cap and trade system, and as you can see, the predictions are that with the link with California and Quebec, the price will be much lower than the federal tax would be. That has advantages and disadvantages. It means that there are fewer incentives to reduce emissions quickly, but it also means that for families and businesses who need some time to buy a new car or change their boiler or insulate their houses or whatever the case may be, they have a little more time and perhaps will be able to get ready before they have a serious impact. This slide is interesting because this helped us to think through what the impact of the cap and trade system will be on who pays what. And we know how many allowances will be issued every year. And under the Climate Act, 5% of those allowances have to go into a price reserve. You see that's the dark gray at the top. And then the light gray is the free allowances that go to the large industries. Now, when you look at those free allowances, one of the things that is important to remember is that we have a large amount of fixed process emissions in Ontario that industries can't reduce. For example, when you make steel out of iron ore, it releases carbon dioxide and the oxygen comes from the ore. And so altogether, there's about 21 megatons of that in Ontario. These are emissions that the industries cannot operate without emitting. And that's most of what they're getting free allowances for. So if you take away what goes to the reserve and what goes out in free allowances, we have our best guess as to how many allowances will be available at auction each year. Then that shows in the blue. Now what we're showing in the orangey brown is how much of that is going to be needed for petroleum products. Now what we've done on this slide is assume that transportation demand doesn't increase but doesn't decrease. Now that's already would be a real improvement because transportation demand's been getting worse every single year. But the fuel distributors don't control how much fuel their customers use. It's not like a foundry that could invest money in making themselves more efficient. So right now, in 2017, the fossil fuel distributors would need about 60% of Ontario's allowances sold at auction. And just 3 years from now, they're going to need 70%. And that's going to continue to go up. So you can see that unless something changes, there's going to be a squeeze coming sooner or later. One of the things we know is that the Western Climate Initiative does need to do some fine-tuning to reduce the oversupply of allowances that California has at the moment, and I'm glad to answer some questions about that if you like. Good news is the law in California requires them to do it, and the California Air Resources Board has got started in the process of figuring out how it's going to do it. So we made a recommendation, the government should work on that. Now, one of the other ways that petroleum products distributors can be able to sell gasoline and diesel is that they can use offsets for 8% of the compliance obligation. It doesn't have to be just allowances. And that could be a really good idea. Now, we do know that, well, where would they get these offsets from? So I already mentioned that about 18% of Ontario's emissions are not capped. And in theory, there may be some opportunities to reduce those uncapped emissions that are cheaper than reducing the capped ones, because the capped ones, by and large, relate to energy costs, where people already have some incentive to reduce. The uncapped ones, by and large, relate to things that are accidental and unwanted, and so there's been no financial incentive to reduce them up until now. So there might be some cheap opportunities. There's two kinds of offset credits. One is if a capped emitter could help an uncapped emitter reduce their emissions, well, then you can shift. The capped emitter could emit more, the uncapped emitter would emit less. The net impact on the atmosphere would be the same, but the cost might be less. And so you could see where that could have some advantages. There is another kind of offset credit which is more complicated, which is not to reduce what the uncapped emitters release, but to help the uncapped emitters to actually take carbon dioxide that's already in the atmosphere back out again. Now, in principle, that could work, but it's really hard to do it well. Now, if it can be made to work well, there's a lot of advantages to offsets. They can provide revenue recycling. They can provide real financial support in rural and remote areas that need and deserve the money and maybe don't have as many options as people in the cities do. But for an offset to work, remember the key thing about a compliance offset credit is allows a capped emitter to put more carbon dioxide, more greenhouse gas into the air than the cap allows. And everything that the capped emitters put into the air, that's going to do long-term climate damage. About a quarter to a fifth of the carbon dioxide we're releasing today, still going to be in the atmosphere, trapping extra heat 1,000 years from now. So if we're going to allow capped emitters to emit extra on the ground that the offsets have taken carbon dioxide out of the air, or at least have reduced their own, it's got to be real. It's got to be quantifiable. It's got to be additional. It's got to be new reductions. It's got to be permanent. It's got to just leak somewhere else. You can't say, okay, we're reducing emissions here, but we'll have more somewhere else. And we have to be able to tell for sure that it's happened. And these are hard things to do, especially for sequestration. So would they really, really, really provide reductions? And these three issues, additionality, leakage, and permanence, I mean, they're head crackers, they're complicated, but they are the key Achilles heels of offset credits. And if an offset protocol doesn't meet these three rules, it's not legit. And the challenge that we had, so the government told us that they're proposing to adopt 13 kinds of offset protocols. We've only seen one of them so far, that's the landfill gas protocol. But we don't know yet exactly what they're going to do for the others, but they said they're going to be adapting what's happening in California and Quebec. So we looked at what's happening in California and Quebec, and we put them through those tests, the international clear tests as to what makes a good offset credit, and we scored them to the best of our ability. And as you can see, we came up with 4 kinds of scores. One of them, which is about, can you really stop cows from what I will politely call enteric fermentation? Well, all we can say about that is there isn't enough information for us to even reach a score. Other than that, some of them we thought are clearly worth doing. Those got the green. Some of them we thought we've got some significant concerns, but it may be possible to address them. So we gave those a yellow light. And there were 2 that we thought really have high risk of serious concerns, especially on additionality, leakage, and permanent, that have a very high chance of making them unacceptable. And those are the 2 we gave the red dots, which are conservation, cropping, and forest management, which, not coincidentally, have been the 2 most popular offset credits in other programs because they're the easiest to claim, but they have the highest risks. So I imagine we'll have some questions on the offset credits, in particular why we said yes to urban forest projects, yellow for afforestation, reforestation, but no to forest management. And one of the key reasons is that the analysis that was provided to us and what California does on forest management, we really think doesn't pass muster. So just to give you a very simple example, California claims, gives credits for reducing wood harvest in a particular forest or woodlot. And they say or assume that 20% of that wood demand that would otherwise have come to this forest goes somewhere else, and the rest of it vanishes. Well, we know that the international wood market doesn't operate like that. Wood demand doesn't vanish just because a particular forest in California gets protected. All that happens is that wood demand goes somewhere else and other trees are cut down. So in our view, there is no climate benefit from that warrants an offset credit. So that's an example. We have a number of other concerns, and we'd certainly encourage you to read the chapter. Now, one other thing I did want to point out is that the proposal that we got from, to the extent that we understood it from the province, was all about Crown land. And we didn't look specifically at the admittedly different situation of private woodlots in southern Ontario that are not Crown land. We're interested in learning more if someone has a proposal, an idea for how our concerns that we've tried to lay out clearly in the report can successfully be addressed, particularly on permanence, leakage, and additionality for private woodlots in southern Ontario. We're interested in learning more. We will be looking at forests again in our environmental protection report this fall, focusing on southern Ontario woodlots. One other thing that's important to recognize when we talk about offset credits is this is in the context of our Climate Act, which is focused on Ontario's emissions that we report internationally. And if you look at this drawing, you'll see that this isn't to scale, but the red circle indicates what's in our official inventory, which was 166 megatons in 2015. About 82% of that is capped, the rest isn't. But there's a lot more that happens in Ontario or that is caused by Ontario that's not in the inventory at all. And for emissions from the forest, especially the natural flux as forests grow and burn, it's not part of the inventory at all. And we could screw up the entire system of numbers if we allow emissions from outside the inventory to be excuse for increasing what happens inside the inventory. Two other chapters I'm going to try to get through quickly. First of all, the greenhouse gas reduction account. I know there's a lot of interest in how well the government is spending the money. And all we were able to look at this year were some fairly basic questions because we got this new mandate to provide transparency on this question rather late. We got the data even later and the folks to do the work even later than that. But at least we got started on it. We will do more next year. So bottom line, how well is the government using the money from cap and trade? And the short answer is it was a good start, but it's got to do better. So this drawing, by the way, is the province's drawing. And I will remind you, as I keep reminding them, that this is a bad way to show it. Because what the province does over and over and over again is suggest that cap and trade applies only to big industries with big smokestacks. This is a common misapprehension. It's wrong. The government makes it worse every time they do a graphic like this. Because as I've already explained, only about a quarter of the emissions come from places with big smokestacks. So most of them are from the rest of us. But anyway, leaving that aside, what it tries to show is that the money is raised from the auctions. And I also said that most of the auction money is coming from the fossil fuel distributors, not from the large final emitters, because they get most of their emissions for free. So this is a really confusing graphic. But anyway, money comes from the auctions. It goes into the greenhouse gas reduction account. They're supposed to use the money either for what's in the climate change action plan or for other good initiatives. But it all is required by law to be reasonably likely to reduce or support the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And what's clear and important about that is it cannot be used for getting ready to cope with climate change. It can't be used for adaptation. And it can't be used for other good causes like electricity conservation, unless it reduces greenhouse gas emissions. And by and large, electricity conservation doesn't reduce greenhouse gas emissions. If you think about it, in 2017, 96% of Ontario's electricity was low carbon. So we have a very clear focus on this legal requirement, and that's what we spend a lot of time looking at. Now, the first three auctions brought in roughly $1.5 billion. $1.37 billion of that had been allocated as of November 2017 when we closed our analysis. This is where the money went. Most of it went to, in fact, almost all of it went to reducing fossil fuels, which are already covered by the cap. So that's a bit of a challenge, but it's to help reduce the cost for people, give them an on-ramp, make it easier to get started. This is a new thing, having a price on carbon. And we were pleased to see that 99% of that first 1.37 billion met the legal minimum test in the Act. Not 100%, but at least it was 99%. In fact, there were some very good proposals, initiatives that get started. And if you think, for example, about reducing fossil fuel use in hospitals and making them more efficient. So that not only reduces their greenhouse gas emissions, it will reduce their operating costs. And what we understand from the Ministry of Health is they'll be allowed to bring those savings back into running the hospitals, which the hospitals badly need. So there's a lot of co-benefits to many of these things. On the other hand, even though there was $1.9 billion more than the government was predicting to get in 2017, they have not rolled out everything that they said they were going to roll out in 2017 in the action plan. So here's, there were about 18 items that were clearly tagged in the action plan to get money in 2017 that didn't get any money yet. One presumes that at some point we may hear further announcements. Our overall assessment was, it was pretty good. What they've done much better than it looked like when we issued our last climate report. And as some of you may remember, at the time, the province was proposing to take $1 billion of this money and use it to subsidize electricity rates, which in my view was clearly illegal. And after we said so, they backed off. So they've got better, they've have a better understanding of what the money can and cannot be used for. It's good to see ministries competing to get access to the cap and trade money and having to learn what climate change is and what greenhouse gas emissions are and what there are opportunities to reduce them. But admittedly, they've got a lot further to go, and they need to treat this money as if it's precious, which it is, and very small in comparison to the problem, which it is. They have a very large problem and a very small amount of time to do it with. This money has to be used with care. And to do that, you've got to use what everybody else does. You have to have metrics. You have to track your progress. You have to know who's accountable for what. And so far, that's not happening, but maybe next year. Also worth noting, I suppose, that they've now allocated to various projects more money than they've received. So hopefully, there is another auction next week. We'll have the results from that the week after. I guess the government's counting on it doing well. We'll see. So we made some recommendations about that. And finally, trucks, one of everybody's favorite topics. So we know that freight emissions are very important, and they're not just important for greenhouse gases, they're also tremendously important for air quality and for public health. But at the same time, trucking is really important for the economy. So what are we going to do about this? We do know that there's 3 main ways to think about reducing emissions from trucks. One is to avoid unnecessary trucking. The second is to improve truck efficiencies. And the third is to shift away from fossil fuel trucking. So those are the kinds of options. And one of the ways to think about how important this is that at the rate that freight is increasing its emissions, by 2050, it will more than use up the entire carbon allowance for the entire province, and nobody else would be able to do anything that had any GHG emissions, which includes the enteric fermentation of the cows. So this is not going to happen. It's primarily a question of heavy trucks, as you can see. Rail and marine are much more efficient. Air is much worse than trucking. One thing about this is that the provincial inventory only covers domestic transportation, so it includes marine and rail and air that's domestic but not international. International marine and air are outside the Paris Agreement framework. They're another set of problems. And heavy trucks have different challenges than light trucks or medium trucks. It's easier to shift away from diesel for the lighter trucks. But in any event, the heavy trucks are the biggest part of the challenge. Now, you've probably heard, and it's absolutely true, that over the last 20 years, there have been some improvements in the efficiency of trucks. And you can see from the little green line, yes, they're actually this is federal rules. There has been some improvement in the efficiency of trucks. And you've also heard the province talk a few times about their green diesel and so on and so forth. Well, you can barely see the little yellow line. That's how much the green diesel has helped. It does help a little tiny bit, but not very much. But those two improvements have been completely blown away by the increase in trucking demand. That since 1990, look how much more freight we haul and how far we haul it. And so somehow that has to change. We do know trucking is really important. Yes, we know trucking is really important, tied to economic growth. We get it. But that's also true all around the world. And what we now see, one of the things that was announced at the climate conference in Bonn in November was a 35 by 35 program by the big international shipping companies around the world to reduce trucking emissions 35% by 2035. And they think that they can do that and maybe even beat it. So how are you going to do it? Well, we looked in particular at some of the things the province is proposing to do are good and will help, and some of them won't. And the ones that in particular we know won't help, in fact, will hurt, is building more roads and certain parts of the Green Commercial Vehicle Program. So the one key thing that the province can do easily, well, we always talk about, well, what really works is inexpensive and fast and demonstrated to really, really work. Well, this is it, road pricing. It really, really works. It dramatically reduces air pollution. It dramatically reduces greenhouse gas emissions. It gives people a financial incentive to be efficient. It doesn't throttle the economy. There's good examples of it around the world. London is one of the ones that we cite in the report, and you all know what Ontario did about road pricing, going in exactly the wrong direction. There's other things you can do as well, improve logistics. About a third of trucks driving around the Greater Toronto area are at least part empty, and many of them completely empty. This is not necessary for our economy. Now, one of the things that really helped improve truck efficiency, and one of the reasons why the industry supported the federal efficiency requirements, is that diesel prices were high. You remember, not that long ago, oil prices were over $100 a barrel. And now that they've fallen so sharply again, and diesel prices have fallen so sharply again, that price factor isn't going to do very much to improve efficiency. And the cap and trade adds a tiny amount to the price, much less than the normal fluctuations of the oil price bounces around. And what that means is public policy is going to have to do more of the heavy lifting if we want to see trucking have more efficiency and lower emissions. And so that's how we get to the Green Commercial Vehicle Program, which, as the government says, is its answer to this. And then we say, oh dear. Because instead of doing things that work, they've chosen some things that are popular. We know that this does work. To take old trucks off the road improves energy efficiency, also improves air quality, and gives truckers money to buy newer trucks, which are more efficient. That's what we think they should do. That's not what they're doing. What the province is doing instead is they're giving subsidies to people to buy new, more efficient trucks. Now, that sounds like a great idea unless you understand how the federal regulations work, because the federal regulations, which are the main force in increasing truck efficiency, are based on fleet average. And that means if somebody buys a more efficient truck, the company then gets to sell a less efficient truck. So the net effect of those subsidies is nothing. Now, in some ways even worse is to subsidize fossil fuel natural gas for trucking. And the government says to us, well, it's the best thing we can do because natural gas is a lower carbon fuel than diesel. And that's true, especially if you only look at what happens when the truck is operating. But it misses two really important points. One is that natural gas engines are less efficient than diesel engines. And the second, and in many ways even more important, is that when you increase the use of natural gas, you increase the amount of methane that gets into the atmosphere. And methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. While it's in the atmosphere, roughly 12 and a half years, it's about 100 times more potent than carbon dioxide. And that is not taken into account when the government says, oh yes, natural gas is better. The credible reason to believe that emissions from natural gas outside of Ontario, and the sources where we get it from, can be as high as 4, maybe even 5%, because the reported emission levels aren't consistent with what we know is in the air. And we also know that emission levels are higher as natural gas comes from fracking, and more of our gas is coming from fracking and less from traditional sources in Western Canada. And if you put all that together, natural gas trucks may actually make things worse. The third thing is, what about electric trucks? So there is some support in the Green Commercial Vehicle Program for electric trucks, but no attention is being paid on issues like standardization. We're not going to have a successful transition unless we can pretty clearly get some understanding as what the standards are, where are the charging infrastructure going to be, and how is it going to be paid for? Because if everybody has to build their own charging infrastructure, it's just not going to make financial sense. Trucks have to charge at both ends of the route. Some good things happening, especially for local trucks, that can also be helpful for air quality in urban areas where traffic from fossil fuel vehicles is now the major source of air pollution and a significant public health threat. So lots of things that maybe can be done, which will make things better, but the government has to refocus what it's doing. So that's what I'm going to run through today. Certainly glad to see that we've got some good questions coming in. We encourage you to download the Act. Also would like to ask you if you have an opportunity to distribute hard copies of the summary or even of the full report, we'd be delighted to get them to you. We had some great help last year from municipalities and universities and other folks who would take a box of the summaries and make them available to their audiences, and we really appreciate that help to get these out to folks. If you're in a municipality and you'd like to have hard copies for your library or for your municipal council or for any group that you think would find it useful and actually look at them, we'll be glad to send them to you. So please let us know.
So thank you, Commissioner. We'll now answer any questions that you might have. Just a reminder that you can submit your questions by using the GoToWebinar control panel in the top right corner of your screen. And so one of our first questions is, you mentioned that 99% of the cap and trade funds were spent properly. Can you just elaborate a bit more about how the other 1% were spent and why they were, in your view, not spent properly?
Well, yes, not in accordance with the Act. So the other 1% were spent on two things. One was adaptation. And as I already indicated, adaptation is very important. We know it's extremely important. It's just not a legal use of the money. And the rest of it was spent on electricity conservation, things like changing the lights. Street lighting, for example, saves municipalities an awful lot of money to go to LEDs, but it almost never saves greenhouse gases because we have very, very little greenhouse gas emission from nighttime electricity in Ontario. So it's just not an okay, as far as I'm concerned, for there to be some infinitesimal reduction in greenhouse gas reduction from spending this money. The money is too scarce and the problem is too great to allow it to be dribbled away ineffectively. It's got to have a material and substantial contribution to reducing emissions, and changing streetlights doesn't.
The next question that we have is, I read in the report, and I don't think you mentioned it here in the slide deck. Can you just talk about why, in your opinion, the Climate Change Action Plan initiatives won't reduce greenhouse gas emissions in Ontario? That seems counterintuitive.
Yes, thank you for that question. It's not that all of the action plan initiatives won't. The question is, if we give money to help an individual or a group or a sector reduce its fossil fuel emissions, will that reduce greenhouse gas emissions in Ontario as a whole? And I'll tell you why the answer is no. In a cap and trade system, if it's properly designed, the cap tells us how many allowances are issued, and the emissions cannot be greater than the cap. I'm leaving aside the California link for the moment because it's complicated enough. But let's just think about the cap in Ontario. We only have so many allowances each year. For example, it's going to be 88.5 million tons in 2030 for the whole province. The cap limits the supply of allowances, and it's the supply of allowances that limits the emissions. When we make it easier for someone to reduce their emissions, their fossil fuel use rather, then it's a little bit like the green commercial vehicles. If someone reduces theirs, that means someone else can increase theirs. because the cap controls the supply of allowances. The Climate Change Action Plan doesn't change the supply. It only changes the demand and therefore the price. And so if it's cheaper for some to keep buying allowances instead of reducing, there's no financial incentive for them to reduce. Bottom line is nothing in the action plan changes the supply of allowances. The supply of allowances is the control on what our emissions will be. So all we do is affect demand, which only reduces the price for the allowances. I hope that helps.
Okay, thank you.
Some people are nodding, some people are not nodding. It's, I know it's complicated, those damn economists.
So you talked a bit about what the GGRA money is being spent on. Do you have any other suggestions or recommendations in terms of what the money should be spent on? How else the government should be using it?
Well, absolutely. One of the things that is quite clear is that we've already said there's 18% of allowance of emissions that are outside the cap and trade system. Offsets are one way of seeing some reductions there, but there is a number of things that really are not suitable for offset credits for the reasons that I talked about. And if you think about forestry, for example, using some of the cap and trade money to improve forestry management, to protect woodlots, to build up carbon in forests, that to me would be a good use of the money, the cap and trade money, even if it isn't a proper use of the offset credits. Because again, the offset credits allow capped emitters to emit more. Using the money has to simply make things better and give us a pathway forward. Anything that reduces emissions in the uncapped sectors in Ontario, that would be a really good thing to do.
So this question talks about GHG reductions in commercial buildings. And it's framed as, what is the plan to incentivize GHG reductions in commercial buildings? Do you?
I think you're asking me, what is the government's plan?
Yeah.
And some of that is stuff they haven't announced yet. One important piece is the requirement that large commercial buildings report their energy and water use and their GHG emissions. Because we know, and we reported on this in Every Drop Counts last year, how important benchmarking is. So benchmarking, making that data available through Portfolio Manager, we know will encourage people to reduce their emissions, so that will help. We also know that you can't do everything through cap and trade, and so codes, standards, energy efficiency rules will help. The improvements in the building code will help for newer buildings, and the government may or may not have other proposals for what they're going to do to help commercial buildings. But frankly, commercial buildings often don't need help. They will save money if they use less fossil fuels. And so, we keep hearing there's lots and lots of opportunities for commercial buildings to get more efficient. And they can just get at it. They'll get a good payback.
So staying on the topic of buildings, do you think that the changes to the building code are enough to drive substantial changes in emissions?
Well, nothing that we're doing is enough. But Ontario's building code has been achieving on average a predicted 13% reduction in energy use per building code cycle 5 years. That's pretty good on an international basis. It doesn't do anything for existing buildings, and we have a huge existing building stock. We certainly think they can and must do a lot more than that, but the newer buildings are a lot better than the older buildings. And we're also seeing more expertise in how to run buildings. So one of the interesting things is that running a building turns out to be not that simple. And the energy use of a building is heavily dependent on how well it's run, how well it's commissioned, how well the management works with the tenants and so on. And that's an area where knowledge expertise is getting a lot better. And I heard some great stories last year. One was about a landlord who started organizing an ice cream competition for the tenants. And whichever floor reduced its emissions the most got ice cream. And that apparently was very powerful in getting tenants interested.
So this is a question about agriculture. Can you give some suggested ways and the most effective ways for Ontario farmers to contribute to reducing their greenhouse gas emissions contributions?
Well, I'm so glad you asked that. We did a special report on soil and particularly carbon in soil in late 2016, I think. It's still available on our website. And one of the things we looked at was the how important are the ecological services that farmers provide, and how many wins there are when the organic matter in soil is built back up. We've lost about 30% of the organic matter in Ontario agricultural soil in the last generation, and that's bad for the farmers, and it's bad for the lakes, and it increases susceptibility to floods and to droughts, and it increases erosion, which takes off pesticides and fertilizers. It's just bad all the way around. I was delighted to see that the state of Iowa now provides farmers with a discount on their crop insurance premiums if they plant cover crops. So the kinds of tools, the soil health approach to build up organic matter in soil, very, very powerful. We also know that nitrous oxide from nitrogen use is, again, a very powerful greenhouse gas. It's about 200 times more potent than carbon dioxide. So better fertilizer management, again, saves farmers money, keeps the lakes cleaner, reduces carbon dioxide emissions. Farmers have an enormously important role.
So the next question asks you to put on your, or to look deep into the crystal ball in terms of the offset protocols. We talked about the fact that there were 13 that the government was currently developing. Do you have any idea when they may be expected to be ready, and or whether or not offset credits actually can be created before the protocols are completed?
Right. I keep looking for the crystal ball that they promised me when I was appointed commissioner. I haven't found it yet. I can tell you that the offset regulation says that it is possible for the ministry to recognize offsets that were created as early as 2007. That doesn't mean necessarily that they will, but at least the legal power is there to do it. In terms of when they're going to be releasing the protocols, I can tell you that every date they've given me, they've missed. Last year they said they would have it in 2017, and then they said they'd have the first 3 early in 2017 and the rest by the end of the year, and then they said they'd have 3 by the end of the year, and anyway, they got 1 done. So it's slow, and perhaps we made it slower with our recommendations because we're asking a lot more hard questions, but we know that they have a consultant and they have a working group and they're working on it, and presumably someday we'll see something.
And so the cap decline rate on the cap and trade program, it's currently declining at a rate of about 4%. Should it keep declining at that rate, or why does it slow down?
Well, why questions are always challenging. We can try to answer what questions about what the government is doing and how we evaluate those things, but why they do things, that's a whole other set of choices. I can tell you that it's a straight line reduction from 2020 to 2030. It's also interesting that they assumed in drawing that line that there would be no reductions in the uncapped sectors, which means that the reductions had to bite more in the capped sectors. But exactly why they chose 2.9, I'm afraid I don't know.
Okay, so the question here is with regard, you mentioned that there was a number of the increasing amounts of natural gas came from fracking. Do you have any idea of how much of the natural gas used in Ontario was generated by fracking?
Right. So I don't have a current number. The Ontario Energy Board said, I think a year or so ago, that they expected our U.S. content from basically fracked gas to go from 21% to, I think, 71% within the next few years, but I don't know where we are in the transition.
Okay, and you mentioned something about the Green Bank. Can you just expand a bit more about the Green Bank? And the question here is whether or not individuals can invest.
Right. That's a very fair question, and it is one of the misleading things about calling it a green bank. That isn't what they set up in Ontario. Green On is, at the moment anyway, in the business of giving money away, partly for existing building retrofits and partly for goods manufacturers. They don't have an investment opportunity. We will be looking in my next report will be on energy. As you folks probably know, I'm required by law to report each year on climate, on energy, and on environmental protection. And the energy report is the next one. And we will be looking there at net metering, which is in the long-term energy plan as an opportunity for individuals. So stay tuned.
So you talked a bit about the use of the 20-year methane global warming potential And can you just explain why did our report use that and not the 100-year GWP, particularly in the context of trucks? You were discussing it.
Right. So the question is, what is it that we're trying to do? It has become conventional around the world to talk about greenhouse gases in terms of 100-year global warming potentials, because when you're comparing things that are apples and oranges, you need some common denominator to compare them with. And every different greenhouse gas behaves in a different way. And the number 100 was picked partly because it's a round number and easy to multiply by, and partly because there was some thought that maybe that would represent about how long carbon dioxide stayed in the atmosphere, although it turns out that wasn't a very good approximation. What we know about methane is that it's highly potent as a greenhouse gas, but that it doesn't stay in the atmosphere very long. And so if you calculate a 100-year global warming potential, what you're basically doing is averaging out the really bad impact that happens in the first 12 years and the fact that it's not there for the next 91 or 81 years to say, well, of course, it's not really that bad. But it really is that bad, and it really is that bad now. And we are in a pivot point now. As I say in my climate science presentation, Secretary General of the United Nations said 2 years ago that we have 5 years, maybe 10, to choose a future. So it's absolutely true that in the very, very long run, everything that's get added to the atmosphere makes things worse. But in terms of choosing a future, whether we're going to blow over tipping points after which we will not have a recognizable world, then what we're doing right now matters enormously. And averaging out methane, which hides its effects in what is really happening now, is bad public policy because it closes our eyes to what's happening now, which we could do something about in order to average it out with other kinds of gases.
Another question, you talked a bit about the link with California, and last year, I know the question is, last year you indicated that money would be going out from Ontario to California. Can you just, I understand you've modified that position a bit. Will the link with California result in money going from Ontario to California? That's the question.
Right. Well, the short answer is I'm still looking for that crystal ball. We have a couple of reasons why we think there'll be less money going, that there may still be money going to California temporarily, but not necessarily so. And one of the reasons is that, first of all, Ontario emissions are down. Already, they were down 4 megatons from 2014 to 2015, partly efficiencies, partly the weather. And so when our emissions go down faster than the cap goes down, then we have a little more flex in Ontario. The second is that in the numbers we were using last year, there were no numbers for offsets because government wasn't at all clear what the government was doing with offsets, and offset credits can provide a lot of flex, and Ontario is proposing to accept offset credits from anywhere in Canada. So if the economics work as they often do, and offset credits are cheaper than allowances, then people will buy offset credits and won't need to buy California allowances. A third big thing that's happened since last year, which I think I alluded to, is California had a dramatic new statute passed in the summer of 2017. And one of the things that does is require California to get serious about its oversupply. They also adopted a new scoping plan, which starts reducing their oversupply by moving unsold allowances into a reserve. So we don't need to buy as much from California. They are doing more to reduce their surplus. And the offset credits gave a safety valve. So when we put all those together, you'll see there's a chart in the technical appendix that if Ontario emitters use a full 8% offset credits, they may not need to buy much, if anything, from California. And in fact, if we look ahead into the next decade, California's cap is going to get steep much faster than ours in the next decade, and they may need to buy from us.
So I note that it's 3 o'clock now, but the questions are still coming in. So we will remain on the line for a bit longer to answer any more questions or a few more questions. If you have to go, just a reminder that Obviously, we'll be sending out the webinar and the slide deck to everyone. There's a couple of other chapters that we didn't review in the webinar that are included in that slide deck, but we will remain live for a few more moments until the questions begin to trickle. So the next.
Well, that's a big promise.
So just a question about the government of Ontario has made a commitment to go carbon neutral. Do you know anything more about their plan, and is there a strategy that you have heard of? Is it available, achievable?
Thank you for the great questions, everybody. So the province's plan, as we understand it, is to reduce what they can of what they are already reporting and to buy voluntary offsets to make up for those. So they have, our offset chapter was focused on compliance offsets, which can be used by compliance entities to offset their own emissions. The Ontario government is not a compliance entity. But they have said that they're going to buy voluntary allowances. We recommended that they could, voluntary offset credits. We recommended that they should only buy those in Ontario, and they've said yes, they're only going to buy them in Ontario. And I know they've been talking to First Nations, and I think they've been talking to the agriculture groups and probably to forestry as well as to what kind of offset credits are going to be available. I know that the Haliburton Forest has entered into a protocol to create voluntary offset credits there that perhaps might be available for the province to buy. So I think that they will be able to find, if they get at it soon enough, they will be able to find offset credits to buy. One of the things that we look at, though, in our report is, and particularly if you look at chapter 7 and 8, is that the province doesn't recognize its full emissions. It's only actually recognizing about half of them. So basically what they're promising is to be carbon neutral for half of their emissions. It's a good start. We'd like to see them do that and then move on, but it is a good start.
So another question about offsets, and it's with regard to solid waste. Solid waste contributes to a significant number of GHGs, but the question says it's not a compliance offset sector. What is Ontario's best opportunity to reduce GHGs from landfill?
Right. So there are two. The best opportunity is don't put organics in the garbage, right? So less food waste, compost it, feed it to animals or something. Don't put it in the landfill. So the organic diversion strategy that the province is pursuing under the Waste Free Ontario Act is very, very important in that respect, and it's something we have pushed hard for, and we're glad to see them moving ahead on. The other piece of that is landfill gas capture. So as you saw, the only protocol we have now in Ontario is for landfill gas capture. All larger landfills are already required to have some landfill gas capture, but we looked at the efficiency of those systems a few years ago, and a lot of them left a lot of room a lot of things to be desired. So there is an opportunity to improve the capture of methane from Ontario landfills and to sell that, use it as energy, put it in trucks, sell it into the grid. I know Bullfrog Power is selling me landfill gas from Quebec, which I'm now using to heat my house. There's a lot of other folks who would buy that stuff if it was available.
So the next question gets into the Western Climate Initiative. If the link with the WCI is expected to result in a lower carbon price than the federal price at $50 a ton, how will the federal plan affect Ontario cap and trade?
Right. So I tried to explain this earlier. Basically, it won't. The federal pan-Canadian framework says that every province can choose A or B. A, they can have a carbon tax, as long as it's at least as high as the federal carbon tax. Or B, they can have a cap and trade system, as long as it reduces emissions as much as the federal commitment. And as I showed on that slide with the brown diamond, the Ontario's cap and trade system and Quebec's will easily meet the federal requirements now that we know what the caps will be until after 2022. If a province does neither imposes a carbon tax as high as the federal tax and does not have a cap and trade system that will produce at least equivalent results, then the federal government will impose its own carbon tax. And the fun thing then happens is what happens with the money. If a province asks the federal government, according to the current position of the federal government and the current draft of the federal tax. If a province asks the federal government to impose its tax, then the provincial government will get the money. If the province does not cooperate with the federal government will decide who gets the money.
Okay, so we'll shift gears here to the Green-on, the bank, back to the bank. Seems to be oversubscribed. Can you make any guesses as to why the government is limiting funds?
Well, the short answer is what I tried to say before, is the problem is very, very large, and the amount of money that's available is pretty small. I mean, 1.9 billion is an awful lot of money to me, but it is just not an awful lot of money for the scale of the problem that we have. Ontario's economy is roughly an $800 billion a year economy, and we need to do a transformation of the energy basis of our economy that no one's ever seen before. The problem is enormous. And there isn't enough money for everybody who wants it. I mean, in fact, there's bloody pitched battles over the money. If money keeps rolling in through the auctions or through a carbon tax, gradually over time, the Harvard Project on Climate Pricing predicts that there will eventually be money for all the good uses for it, but it'll take a while.
So I'm going to say we just have time for about 3 or 4 more questions. So if people had any others, we have some that have come in. One of them is with regard to, we talked about California's offset protocols in forestry. Do you have any thoughts in terms of Quebec's approach to forestry offsets?
Sorry, I can't answer that one off the top of my head. We did most of our examination on California, which we understood to be the principal model that Ontario was following.
Okay, and the other one is with regard to, you have any insight into what's happening with the electric vehicle charging infrastructure and free EV charging?
Right. So the question there is, in the action plan, one of the many promises that has not yet seen the light of day is the promise that everyone with an electric vehicle would get free overnight charging for 4 years. There's a lot of reasons to do that. Ontario has a lot of surplus electricity most nights, especially spring and fall. And we could very easily and properly use that for charging electric vehicles. I think the challenge is that the province is finding it's harder than they thought to figure out how they're going to actually do that. In my house, for example, I only have one electric meter. I don't have a separate one for my car. So how do they know how much electricity I'm using for my car? I'm told there is technology that would allow the system to be able to tell, but that technology isn't available everywhere. And in fact, many of the local distribution utilities still don't have enough two-way control for all the kinds of things that they're trying to do, smart grid and otherwise. So I think they're still thinking about it, but I'm waiting.
So another question's just come in, and again, I'm just going to take maybe 2 more questions at this point. Can you explain what role the government can play to get the 75% of us who are not LFEs, large final emitters, to reduce emissions?
Well, I would say, first of all, that it's not just for the government. Right? That climate change is much too big a problem to be left only to the government. And as I say to everyone, no one can do everything, but everyone can do something. So one of the things the government is doing is trying to raise awareness, just as we are, that this is the most important challenge of our generation. And if we love our kids, we need to reduce our fossil fuel emissions. So motivation is first of all. In terms of financial incentives, that's what the price on carbon is supposed to do. It's pretty modest so far. I don't know a lot of people who will make big changes in their lives to save $8 a month, but at least it might give people some incentive. There is a lot Green-on is supposed to help people figure out what to do. There is some support for technology providers so that if you want to buy something that's better, it'll be available. The electric vehicle incentive, for example, makes it easier for people to buy electric vehicles. So they do, many of the things in the action plan are intended to help, encourage, nudge, assist people to reduce. But everyone can reduce. And I ask every audience I speak with, for every person, every family, every company, every municipality, at every level, figure out your carbon footprint and reduce it 5% a year. And everyone can do that. You can do it different ways. You can reduce it reduce how you fly, reduce how much meat you eat. You can reduce, change what you drive, make your house more efficient, use landfill gas. Everyone has ways to do it. And we all have to. And what I would certainly encourage you is to speak up, because Canadians tend to assume that everybody else already knows, and it's not true. People want to know that they're not the only ones. And so if other people hear you talking about it, maybe they'll do something too.
Okay, so two more questions. One of the questions is with regard to the small and medium manufacturers. Is the government helping them reduce emissions, and what will happen after the end of the CME Smart Green program?
I keep looking for that crystal ball.
And the final question is another crystal ball kind of question.
Oh, okay. Well, let me see.
Sure.
I mean, again, in terms of small and medium-sized manufacturers, what help do they need? Different people need different kinds of help. If they're goods manufacturers, that is one of the kinds of responsibilities that Green On is trying to take on, is to figure out how to help those folks. There is some money that's been made available from the cap and trade funds to support converting machinery and equipment. It's also true that as the price on carbon increases, there will be more and more money to save by becoming more efficient. The province is funding training, so there are more people who know how to help industries to improve. So there's the benchmarking information will help people to know better, where to focus. When people say what help, I think they're quite often thinking, well, will you give me money to do this? And that's not the only kind of help that's relevant. Some of that is available. The federal government is offering some money as well. But a lot of it still makes sense for people to do for themselves. Saving energy, even at lower oil prices, saves money. So what is the payback? Well, maybe it's not a 6-month payback. Maybe it's not a 2-year payback. But if you're going to be in business more than 2 years, you don't need a 2-year payback for something to make sense.
And the final question, again, I'm going to ask you to look into the crystal ball. Given that it's an election year, I think a lot of people are wondering about what will happen if a new government is elected. Will the new government, whoever they may be, cancel cap and trade?
Well, I don't know what a new government will do, but if Ontario doesn't have a price on carbon of our own, we'll have the federal one, and then the federal government will determine what to do with the money. Would that be better? I don't know.
So I'm going to say thank you to everyone for all of your questions. We will be, as I mentioned at the beginning, we will be sending around the slide deck, and the link to the webinar will be available on our website as well. If you've not already done so, you can sign up for eco updates on our website to be advised of upcoming reports and events. And once again, just to note that the slide deck will be more comprehensive. It will cover a couple of other chapters that we didn't include in the webinar today. If you have any other further burning questions that you'd like to ask the Commissioner, you can always reach us through our website. But again, I'd like to say thank you for joining us today, and have a great afternoon.
And I want to say thank you to the team who worked so incredibly hard to get this report out. Thanks, everybody.